Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Rob Bair, the Chief Information Security Officer in Residence at Zscaler, and Robert Sheldon, the Senior Director for Public Policy and Strategy at CrowdStrike. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. As we continue our discussion today about building national resilience, it's clear federal agencies understand resiliency better than they did a couple of years ago or even a year ago. What are you seeing around the idea of resiliency? How are agencies thinking about it, particularly with the adoption of zero trust? Robert, let me go to you first.
Thank you for the question. There's been a lot of interest from the community over the past number of years in increasing resiliency in our IT and OT networks. This is true in industry, and there's a lot of interest in government from the White House, CISA, and the federal agencies, and even in Congress, and looking at how we can enhance the resilience of national cybersecurity overall. There's been a lot of new tools, new concepts, and even new best practices that have developed even over the last number of months and years. And it's been interesting to see policymakers and federal IT professionals really try and work with industry and work with each other to sort of codify those new best practices and adopt them across the extended federal enterprise.
Yeah, I agree with what Robert says. I mean, we're fortunate to have top-down leadership engagement here from, starting with Dan Neuberger and Executive Order 14028, which was mandating, zero trust in modern architectures. In addition to the leadership we see at the Office of the National Cyber Director under Harry Coker, and at the department and agencies level with Jen Easterly, and at the secretary and deputy secretary level. I mean, it's actually driving adoption across government. So it's great to see the leadership, which has resulted in, strategies and offices stood up within these department and agencies. I think secondly, we've seen, the Technology Modernization Fund, or the TMF, which can be leveraged to accelerate digital transformation across agencies. I mean, for example, the Department of Energy has a $20 million TMF authorization that's going to allow them to roll out modernization across their lending infrastructure, which is going to make it easier for their customers to access things using kind of a zero trust architecture. So overall, these types of things will give us a more secure and resilient infrastructure in federal government. And then I think finally, from a technology perspective, we're seeing, one, the adoption of MFA and identity across the federal government. And again, coming out of 14028, which is the underpinning of zero trust. So we're happy to see that. And then really kind of where Zscaler shines is in the secure access service edge business, right? Which is a combination of technologies. It's called Access Security Broker, Firewall as a Service, Secure Web Gateway, and data loss prevention, and all these other things that the interagency has kind of identified to say, hey, if we want to have secure access to applications and data, we need to adopt this secure access service edge approach. And so we're happy to see that and be a part of it alongside CrowdStrike.
And let's move to the conversation about zero trust, because right now agencies are facing a lot of deadlines. So, for example, the Defense Department is supposed to reach their target level of zero trust by 2027. So they're working on that. And of course, there has been a lot of focus, just like you mentioned, on identity. But where are you also seeing a lot of agencies focus? And, as you're witnessing all of this, what's worked for the agencies, what hasn't worked, what are some of the roadblocks that organizations are facing as they're going down this path?
There's a lot of different challenges that agencies face just in the course of normal business in terms of developing modern architectures. Some of that, of course, is know-how, but really some of these best practices for how to implement zero trust strategies are becoming well known now, and there's a great deal of talent within federal agencies, within IT staff, in terms of bringing those new technologies and new concepts to bear. So that's an exciting development. Of course, there's also policy, which makes things sometimes challenging. There's resource constraints, which agencies must deal with, and a lot of other roadblocks as well. But it's been really inspiring to see some of the progress just over the last couple of years for how effective teams across the federal enterprise have been able to work through those challenges and still get to much better cybersecurity outcomes. There is more attention from everywhere in terms of being able to provide resourcing and then to do it flexibly. Rob mentioned technology modernization funds. Really, technology modernization is it's a generational challenge and something that the government will need to focus on across the federal agencies for a long period of time. So it's important to have some of these strategies in place that will allow resourcing to sort of flexibly adopt new technologies as they arrive, and then also to have a vendor community and partners that can understand some of the challenges in terms of dealing with legacy applications and legacy systems, because that is a fact of life for people in this community. And there are identity-based solutions and other technologies that can be used to try and ensure that there's safe usage of those technologies where they must exist for the period where they must exist. And then hopefully over time, all new technologies that we acquire will have sort of some of these native attributes that make them accessible on a zero trust basis, and be able to enforce that concept everywhere. So we are, again, trending in the right direction. It's just that we all as a community need to focus on making sure that those concepts are brought to bear consistently over time.
Totally agree with Robert here. I mean, I think there are several challenges, from a very specific perspective. I think if we look at the logging memo, which is MTech 22 Tech 31, that's a 44-page document that the federal government released, and it's very in-depth, and the requirements are very broad. Very broad means very complex, which means very extensive for departments and agencies to adopt. So as a former incident responder, when I was in uniform in the federal government, there was nothing more frustrating than showing up to a victim organization and asking for their logs, and they say, yeah, about that, we don't have them. So I think this is a very good thing. I think it's going to take a little bit of time for federal departments and agencies to hash this out. We also see a renewed focus on the federal cybersecurity workforce, or the cyber workforce in general. You see the memo coming out of the Office of the National Cyber Director within the last couple of weeks, taking away some of the degree requirements and really kind of making it easier and lowering the barriers to entry for the cyber workforce, which we think is a great thing. But at the end of the day, I think we're still 500,000 skilled workforce short for zero trust implementation. So that kind of makes it a challenge. And then from an organizational perspective, as we all know, change is sometimes the hardest thing to adopt within our organizations, right? And you have these legacy architectures that are 30 years old, and you're telling people they need to move to a zero trust network architecture, which is hard to see in some cases. So you have departments and agencies standing up their own zero trust program management offices to coordinate these efforts effectively. And so there's a little bit of growing pains associated with that. And then, finally, I think, which is overall a good thing, you have the development of zero trust strategies coming out of each department and agency. And the thing that I hope doesn't happen is that those disparate strategies lead to adoption strategies that don't leverage economies of scale that we could get from, utilizing best in breed platforms like Zscaler and CrowdStrike to implement the strategy that they adopt. So,
yeah, and given all these restrictions and limitations that we just talked about, and there are a lot more to discuss, but could you talk to the piece where, how can agencies prioritize their resilience, and meet those deadlines? What are some of the things that they should consider? What are maybe some of those low-hanging fruit that they can focus on to build that momentum and then build upon it? And, we talked about people, processes, technologies, but could you talk maybe about what process changes that agencies, could take advantage of without having a lot of resources?
There's a lot of inspiring work going on because people are constrained in various ways, whether it's from resources or through policy, but still finding ways to demonstrate success on this long challenge towards zero trust and to just improve cybersecurity generally. So there's a lot of anecdotes out there. I think in general, though, if you were to distill it, it's finding people that have clarity on within their particular agency, a specific program even, or a specific agency that maybe has, maybe it's due for a technology upgrade anyways, or it is fit for some reason, it just meets criteria for being able to use a pilot maybe to try some new technology, to be able to prove that out and to help decision makers at a department level, maybe even look and see, is this sort of technology or this configuration or this architecture or this integration going to be applicable for some broader need that we have? So being able to keep the spirit of experimentation intact, and to be able to advance that in areas where it's appropriate. Obviously, it's not appropriate everywhere for every single agency. So having that sort of rule of engagement where people are able to try some of those experiments, I think helps. I think making sure that people aren't being responsive to responsive to some piece of guidance that came out 2 years ago, that where there might be some different approaches gestured at newer guidance or more recent guidance, that they're unable to try that. I think it's a real challenge sometimes to reconcile all the various disparate guidance that agencies must follow. So being able to understand how to, in a compliant way, sort of meet all these things can be a challenge. But as we evolve, we should have an expectation that there's going to be different priorities flagged in some of these different memoranda or strategies and things like that. And then agencies need to have a challenging conversation internally about how they can meet the letter and the spirit of all of these things, and then hopefully doing it in a way where they understand that there's like an end state in zero trust that agencies are all supposed to be marching towards. So requires a little bit, I think, of creativity and a little bit of flexibility. And then the other thing is just making sure that it's not the case that any agency just is going to out of the box have all new technologies, all new architectures. There's always this balance of, like I mentioned before, experimenting with new technologies or concepts, and then also maintaining some of these legacy systems which maybe work right now, where there's a dependency on them somewhere, or there's not going to be resources in the near term to upgrade them. And then to understand, are there any concepts that can help offset sort of these legacy dependencies, and thinking about things like threat hunting. Rob mentioned using a better spending more attention on log management, log analysis, that sort of thing, as a sort of way to offset the fact that there's not going to be on a given day 100% brand new systems that are maybe spec'd the way that a CISO who's working in an agency might design if they had a completely free hand. So thinking about how they can, balance efforts between looking after those legacy systems and then still trying to experiment with the cutting edge. And the people that are doing that most, I think, are finding effective outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the key factors that you can focus on, it's kind of a chicken or the egg problem. Do you focus on securing the network, or do you focus on securing the data? And I from my perspective, I think that we collectively in the federal government care about the data that resides on our networks, and the adversary also cares about that same data. So I think prioritizing data security at every level, north, south, east, west, in motion, in transit, I think that's one thing that should be a consideration for leaders. The second thing, we're all resource constrained. And so that dictates, collaboration and sharing of best practices across departments and agencies to say, hey, this is what worked in our adoption of a zero trust strategy. This is what didn't work well. These are the platforms and the technologies that we think, solve our issues. And then again, going back to the TMF, which Robert and I both mentioned, I think, we need to find these key budget augmentation tools to augment the constrained resources that we have. And then, going back to legacy networks, which Robert just mentioned, organizational flexibility, right? Don't limit your zero trust to legacy organizational structures. You've got to evolve, perhaps even what your org chart looks like, or who is the zero trust champion within an organization. And I don't think we should look at these things from a legacy architecture perspective. You should come in with a fresh perspective and say, if anything were possible, what would our network look like from a zero trust network architecture? And then what are the steps it takes to get there? I think, for leaders, I think you have to ask the question, do we still need to do it the way that we've done it for the past 30 years? And what does that look like? Well, I mean, it would sound like blasphemy if you said, oh, we don't need a physical firewall device in our architecture. If you said that to someone, 10 years ago before, someone like Zscaler comes along, that's a really that's a really tough pill for someone to swallow to say, I don't need a physical firewall anymore. So I think we need to start just asking tough questions of our organization and being flexible to change.
Yeah, and of course, the environment is becoming a lot more complex with agencies migrating to hybrid cloud. Just for 2025, just civilian agencies requested, I think, around 9 billion for programs using cloud technology. So what are you seeing around cloud migration and some of those roadblocks that agencies are having in achieving that resilience? And what strategies can they implement to help improve their resilience?
So I think at the most fundamental level, right, we have to look at, how we do development, right? And so that's prioritizing agile development over kind of the legacy waterfall. And that's not just training our technical teams and our developers. That's looking at, hey, the auditors and the budget officers that give the resources to transition from kind of legacy development and legacy technology to the new technology and methods that we need to put into place. So I think there's a little bit of training across the organization that needs to happen. Earlier I mentioned Secure Access Service Edge, which again is a compilation of different technologies. I think using SASE for governance is important, right? So understanding how a robust SASE solution enhances your multi-cloud governance and security, and those underlying technologies like Cloud Access Security Broker, how does that help you in a multi-tenancy environment? So I think that's also a positive step that we're adapting those technologies. And then finally, I mean, I think it's standardized security controls across multi-tenancy and multi-cloud environments, right? So you have to ensure you have consistent policies across different cloud providers, which in some instances is difficult to do. And so how does that look from a resilience perspective that you asked about earlier? I think from an implementation, that looks like staggered updates across your clouds, right? And for example, speaking very broadly, you would roll out updates to your preview and beta clouds first, do some extensive testing, make sure everything works. Then you would test an update on a subset of your data centers or clouds, a subset which you'd call probably early access or early adopters. You would do the same sort of testing and validation on those early adopters, and then you'd roll out to the remainder of your early adoption data centers. And if everything's working, okay, now you want to go into really kind of the remainder of your clouds and your data centers at a staggered rate, and maybe whether that's 1 hour or 2 hours between each pushed update, while keeping in mind all the way through this that you should maintain the ability to roll these updates back immediately. So I think that there are ways that we're looking at building in resilience, and we talked about leadership from the top down. I think the White House is interested in cloud resilience, and we're fully supportive of that. And Zscaler is doing everything we can alongside CrowdStrike to make sure that our systems are resilient and make sure that our customer needs are met.
I mentioned earlier that IT modernization in the federal space is a generational challenge. There are people who 5 and 10 years ago were working on projects where they were inventorying legacy applications and trying to figure out how they can move those into the cloud and that type of thing. And there are people that are doing that same thing today. I think we should expect that, at least on the margin, people will be doing that 3 and 5 years from now and possibly longer. So just being, understanding there's going to be a process and order of operations that agencies will need to develop uniquely because of their unique constraints or their unique mission sets. And then being able to find ways for them to still be able to do the work that they need to do every day, I think is important to start. I think, though, we're in an interesting time now because so much of this transition has already happened, and there's so much more comfort, native comfort really in federal agencies about using cloud applications and cloud systems and working with cloud architectures. And there's been really interesting work, I think, over the past couple of years about just making sure that there's sort of uniform high level of standards or expectations for across federal agencies for doing some of the basic things like cloud, posture security, and then just doing cloud workload security as well. So there's obviously some inherent gains that agencies have gained by moving applications from legacy systems into the cloud. So those are great, but then being able to make sure that they're doing the nuts and bolts work of cloud security every day, and then hopefully being able to do that in a way that's natively integrated with the other security technologies they're using within the agency, because obviously there are workflows that defenders need to use that would help provide visibility across potential threat activity that might straddle an on-premise system and a cloud system and an application or something else. So just making sure that they have tools in place so that they can do some of that security work in a way that's organic, and they can get a holistic picture of threat activity that they may be facing. That's a very, very important challenge. And again, it's one that will take time for all agencies to be able to do that across on-prem, cloud, applications, et cetera, in a way that's as flexible and as resilient as they might have been able to have in previous years, when really the main challenge for them was on-premise systems. But I think agencies are trending in the right direction.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we keep hearing. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. One additional thing, piggybacking on to what Robert was saying, I think it's important for cloud and cloud resilience to ensure that we have centralized management, right? And so to push out a standardized security policy across multi-tenant clouds, you have to be able to centrally manage it in some sort of control plane, and make sure that all the policies are held in one place, and you can very granularly control each of those policies that you're pushing out, and to make sure that it's behaving in a way that you want it to behave. And so, I just would encourage folks to look at solutions that have centralized management capability.
Yeah, and as we're talking about all this, also the needs will continue to change. So how can agencies ensure that seamless integration? Because that's always the issue. How do we integrate all of those, the new technology? So how can they ensure seamless integration of the security tools across various environments to support their mission?
I think one is interoperability, right? And so when we look at solutions, you want to ensure that to achieve zero trust, you require tools that support open frameworks and interoperability across these multiple environments and multiple tenant clouds. And so you want to look at avoiding solutions that are just a single point solution that say, oh, we don't have an open API to integrate with your other tools. There may be very specific use cases where that's potentially a need, but you should ask a lot of hard questions about why you're not integrating with other tools. And we talk often about a single pane of glass, right? And what is that really? But I think it's just a series of tools that work in conjunction with one another and coherently to give you the best situational awareness at machine speed that you can possibly get to allow you to defend your networks and have the most visibility. And then I think the other thing is, a bit of vendor neutrality. So you want to avoid being constrained by a small set of platform vendors, which limits your agility as an organization to move, and it also limits your ability to innovate in some ways. I just am very leery of having the vendor that builds your cars and manufactures your tires and manufactures your windshield wipers, and then is responsible for the security of your vehicle. I think you just want to have a little bit of vendor diversity to make sure that you're getting and you're conducting, what we used to call 20 years ago defense in depth. Make sure that you have the Zscalers, the CrowdStrikes of the world, the Okta doing your identity, and you have this diversity that says, all right, I'm getting the best in breed platform, and I'm getting the best in breed visibility that I can possibly get to defend my network.
It's also the case that we're in a really interesting time in cybersecurity industry right now. Things tend to evolve in waves. There's a period of time where there's energy and sort of next generation firewall or network technologies, and then there's a time when the industry sort of reconceives of how we handle endpoint security. And I think we're now in a time when people in the industry are looking for next gen SIEM solutions that can help integrate some of these different sorts of technologies. And part of that is just this flexibility in trying to build a sort of architecture that will last for a generation, depending on how we define that. But being able to have solutions that do work together in a way that provides a very straightforward workflow, like I referenced before, for people doing security work to be able to make sure they have visibility across different aspects of their network, which again are getting more complex over time because they're cloud environments, and there's a lot of other application security and just a ton of other different particular security vectors that defenders need to be mindful of. And then just trying to have a coherent approach to be able to work through either threat hunting proactively across all those different platforms and systems, or at least be able to quickly process and aggregate alerts or logs that are generated from across these disparate technologies. And then over some time horizon, as these developments continue to occur and there's some other segment that gets modernized, or there's a new approach, to be able to use that next-gen SIEM as sort of a platform to be able to integrate that new data stream, whether it's threat or alerts, to be able to integrate that into a security program, and then be able to sort of continue the work as these developments take place. That is the vision I think that we're all moving toward now, and it's one where hopefully things will be a lot easier for everybody in the federal space, and clearly folks in industry are moving in this direction as well. So this is something that you've seen people working on in the sort of Fortune 500 major enterprises, and then even small enterprises to some degree or another are working on this problem set as well. So it's something that's sort of resonant for everybody right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a couple of minutes left, but I'm just curious, shifting gears, can you share maybe some examples of how you both are working with the government? So, for example, he says JCDC in terms of enhancing that national resilience.
It's always been the case over the last really couple of decades that people in government have understood, people in industry have understood that there's a need for cooperation, and at various times we'll call that operational collaboration or public-private partnership or something else. But I think it's clear that there's gains to be made for everybody by having a concept in place for how to share. So over the last couple of years, the most recent, and I think personally most powerful version of this, is the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative at CISA, or JCDC. But there's also some really good partnerships that have sprung up across other parts of the broader federal government as well. There's, I think, a lot of interest in making sure that there are sort of places and concepts and communities where, if there is a need to collaborate in some way, obviously as appropriate, then there's sort of clear processes in place for how to do that. And then for the leadership at these organizations to really understand and embody the idea of saying, we understand that we can't conceive in advance of every possible use case for needing to talk to one another. And again, there's always governance in place for what types of conversations are appropriate, but to be able to just say, we have some processes in place, but we're also just willing to talk. And the crop of federal IT executives and really, from the people who just work day to day as individual contributors all the way up to the senior leadership at some of these organizations, in recent years, I think are increasingly accessible. They want to be out talking to people. They're at conferences, and then they do make themselves available to people who participate in some of these structures, and then other vendors as well. And it's clear that there's attention really at every level on making sure that even startups or people that have new technologies are able to have a share of voice in some of those forums as well. It's probably not the case that we've developed the final concept for any of these sorts of things, because as the nature of the IT ecosystem changes and develops and really increases over time, there's going to be new use cases, and new threats will emerge, new best practices will emerge, and really that's kind of the basis for some of the cooperation that happens now, is that there's usually work streams that look at threat, that look at best practices, that can put out guidance, and then can drive cooperation not just with industry but with international partners and that sort of thing. And I think and I hope that type of collaboration will continue to expand over time.
Going back to open and interoperable, I think we're really proud of our partnership with CrowdStrike in particular. We're fortunate to be in a lot of department and agencies, zero trust tech stacks, and in the TMF driven agency funded projects. we have a strong partnership there. And then, we, alongside CrowdStrike, we have new data sharing pathways between Zscaler and CrowdStrike that allow us to do faster and more efficient intelligence sharing and threat response. So we have many partnerships like that on the vendor side. And then from a government perspective, I'll give you two examples. So Zscaler feeds our telemetry from our over 500 billion transactions a day, which generates 500 trillion or so signals into CISA's Claw, which is their cloud version of Einstein. And within that, we created a feature that allows federal civilian agencies to redirect their DNS using encrypted DNS to CISA's protective DNS. To make it easier for departments and agencies to meet the mandate to go to protective DNS. In addition, as Robert mentioned, we're proud to be a part and a member of the JCDC, which our collective visibility from an industry perspective, combined with what the federal government and the signals that they already see, that collectively that makes us stronger and brings down our risk. So we're keen to be involved in more efforts like JCDC, expand our relationships and partnerships within the US, and then to our close partners and allies overseas as well, to make sure that we're preventing criminal actors and ransomware and all of the things that keep us up at night and keep some of the federal government, frankly, probably all of the federal government leaders up at night, because you don't want your network to go down as you're a victim of criminal or state-sponsored malicious activity. So very eager to continue to get our telemetry and our partnership out there to help drive down government risk.
Thank you both so much. We're unfortunately out of time, but it was a great discussion and great insights. I'd like to thank today's guest, Rob Bair, the Chief Information Security Officer in Residence at Zscaler, Rob Sheldon, the Senior Director for Public Policy and Strategy at CrowdStrike. I'm reporter Anastasia Obis, and you're watching Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more on Cyber Leaders Exchange.